Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 12, at the Ministry of Munitions. On July 16, 1917, the Prime Minister invited me to join the new government. He proposed to me either the Ministry of Munitions or the newly created Air Ministry, with the proviso that, if I chose the latter, he must have till the afternoon to make certain personal rearrangements in the administration. I said at once that I preferred munitions, and the matter was settled in as many words as I here set down. The appointment was announced the next morning. There was an outcry among those who at that time had accustomed themselves to regard me with hostility. An immediate protest was made by the Committee of the National Union of Conservative Associations, and an influential deputation of Unionist members presented themselves to the leader of the party in strong complaint. Mr. Lloyd George had, however, prepared the ground with his accustomed patience. Lord Northcliffe was on a mission to the United States, and appeased. Sir Edward Carson and General Smuts were warm advocates. The group of ministers who had successfully prevented my entering the government on its formation was no longer intact. Some had been previously placated, the remnant acquiesced. And Mr. Bonar Law, who had always been a friend, returned a very stiff answer to his deputation. I was re-elected for Dundee by a remarkable majority, and took my duties without delay. Not allowed to make the plans, I was set to make the weapons. The internal conditions of munitions supply, and indeed the whole structure of the British executive, were vastly different from those I had quitted 20 months before, and still more from the days when I was First Lord of the Admiralty. In the first period of the war, indeed almost to the end of 1915, the resources of Britain far exceeded any organization which could employ them. Whatever was needed for the fleets and armies had only to be ordered in good time and on a large enough scale. The chief difficulty was to stretch the mind to a hitherto unimagined size of events. Megalomania was a positive virtue. Indeed, to add a nought or a couple of noughts to almost any requisition or plan for producing war supplies would have constituted an act of merit. Now all was changed. 3 years of the struggle had engaged very nearly the whole might of the nation. Munition production of every kind was already upon a gigantic scale. The whole island was an arsenal. The enormous national factories which Mr. Lloyd George had planned were just beginning to function. The first difficulties with the trade unions about the dilution of labor had been overcome. Hundreds of thousands of women were making shells and fuses cheaper and better than the most skilled craftsmen had done before the war. The keenest spirits in British industry were gathered as state servants in the range of palatial hotels which housed the Ministry of Munitions. The former trickles and streamlets of war supplies now flowed in rivers rising continuously. Nevertheless, the demands of the fighting fronts eagerly and easily engulfed all that could be produced. We were in the presence of requirements at once imperative and apparently insatiable. And now at last our ultimate capacity began to come into view. I found myself in a world of limiting factors and priorities. All problems were complicated by the fact that the Admiralty had not been brought within the general sphere of munitions supply. When the munitions crisis of May 1915 had overwhelmed the War Office and the Liberal government, the Admiralty had not been found wanting in any important respect. All supplies for the fleets were at hand or coming forward in abundance in consequence of the orders we had placed at the beginning of the war, and which had received a further expansion during my partnership with Lord Fisher. The Admiralty, therefore, had been able to retain their separate and privileged position. They had their own great supply departments, their own factories, their own programs, and their own allegiances. In a period when a general view and a just proportion were the master keys, they vigorously asserted their claim to be a realm within a realm, efficient, colossal, indispensable, well-disposed, but independent. In their view, the Navy came first not only in essentials, but in refinements, not only in minima, but in precautionary margins. And of all these the Board of Admiralty was the sole judge. Theirs was the first claim upon materials and skilled labor of all kinds. After that had been met, they were genuinely glad that the armies, the Air Force, and, at a considerable interval, the civil population should be adequately maintained. This dominating position was fortified by the grave anxieties of the U-boat campaign, and lost nothing from the virile personality of the new First Lord. The career of Sir Eric Geddes during the war had been astonishing. As the general manager of an important railway, versed in every detail of its working, from the humblest to the highest, he possessed not only the practical organizing power of a skillful businessman, but the quasi-official outlook of the head of a great public service. To this he added those qualities of mental and physical energy, of industry, of thoroughness and compulsive force, often successful, always admirable, and never more needed than at this time. He had risen rapidly under Mr. Lloyd George to be one of the principal figures of the Ministry of Munitions in its early days. He had reorganized the railways of the British front in France with the rank and uniform of a major general. He had controlled the supply departments of the Navy with the rank and uniform of a vice-admiral. Now the same hand which had conducted him through these swift and surprising transformations placed him at the head of the Board of Admiralty. He reinforced his particularism with an ability and domineering vigor all his own. Judged by the truest sense of proportion, the Navy had a right to absolute priority in all that was necessary to grapple with the supreme peril of the U-boat attack, including the vast replacement of the sunken merchant ships. But when such rights were extended to all the other branches of the naval service, and even to strengthening the battle fleet and increasing its already overflowing resources of stores, guns, and ammunition, a serious inroad was made upon what was due to the armies and to the ever-growing service of the air. The War Cabinet, riveted by the U-boat attack and rightly determined to give the Navy all it wanted for the purpose of meeting it, was not found capable of drawing the necessary distinctions between this and less imperious services. In consequence, the Grand Fleet absorbed in the final phases of the war a larger share of our resources than was its due, and our war effort in the field was unwarrantably diminished to that extent. The principal limiting factors to munitions production with which I was confronted in the autumn of 1917 were four in number, that is, shipping, tonnage, steel, skilled labor, and dollars. The last of these had been rendered less acute by the accession of the United States to the Allies. We had already sold 1,000 millions sterling of American securities, and had borrowed heavily to feed and equip ourselves and our allies before this decisive event. Our transatlantic credits were practically exhausted at the beginning of 1917. The dollar situation was now somewhat relieved. A door that would otherwise have closed altogether was now held partially open. Nonetheless, the limits of the power of purchase, both in American and Canadian dollars, imposed a restrictive finger on the layout of every program. The stringency in shipping was acute. The losses of the U-boat war, the requirements of the armies in every theater, the food and what remained of the trade of Britain, the needs of the Allies, the increasing desires of the United States, and the importations of all the raw materials of war had drawn out our mercantile marine to its most intense strain. Tonnage, therefore, was at this period the controlling factor in our production. Steel ranked next to tonnage, and was a more direct measure of war effort. The steel output of Great Britain had already nearly doubled. Mines which would not pay in peace had come into active production. But in the main we depended for iron ore upon the north coast of Spain, and all vessels which carried it ran perilous voyages amid frequent sinkings. In addition, we bought finished steel to the utmost limit of our dollars from the United States and Canada, as well as shell castings of every intermediate form. Of all we produced or obtained, the Admiralty took their fill. The prime need was the replacement of merchant ships sunk by submarines. The War Cabinet had approved an ambitious program of building 3 million tons of mercantile shipping in 1918. This claimed priority even over the innumerable anti-U-boat flotillas. Next came the improved heavy shell outfits which the disappointing experiences of Jutland were claimed to require. Not till these and other less vital naval demands had been satisfied could the requirements of the British armies for guns, shells, tanks, and indispensable subsidiaries be considered. We had also to provide a large proportion of steel for the French shell factories under arrangements we had made early in the war. And to Italy we had to send both steel and coal in serious quantities under agreements, failure in which would have crippled her fighting strength. Lastly, there were the limits fixed by the supply of skilled labor. And here again the Army and the Air Force clashed with the Admiralty at 100 points. All the most perfect lethal instruments were demanded at once by the three services, and at the same time ever-increasing numbers of skilled artisans were drawn into the fighting sphere. The ceaseless process of training and dilution steadily expanded our supply. But in spite of the earnest help afforded by all the responsible labor leaders, trade union principles and prejudices made every step delicate. Such were the main features of the task with which I had the honor to be entrusted. If I were to attempt to exhaust the details, this chapter would become a volume. We depended, and through us the Allies, upon the sea power which drew from the remotest portions of the globe not only the bulky imports, but all those rare and scarce commodities without which steel cannot be hardened or explosives made, or science realize its full death-dealing power, or an island people get their daily bread. Some of these aspects will emerge in the narrative. The growth of the Ministry of Munitions had far outstripped its organization. A year had passed since its creator, Mr. Lloyd George, had moved on to still more intense spheres. The two gifted ministers who had succeeded him, Mr. Montagu and Dr. Addison, had dealt with the needs as they arose, shouldering one responsibility after another, adding department to department and branch to branch, without altering in essentials the central organization from the form it had assumed in the empirical and convulsive period of creation. All the main and numberless minor decisions still centered upon the minister himself. I found a staff of 12,000 officials organized in no less than 50 principal departments, each claiming direct access to the chief and requiring a swift flow of decisions upon most intricate and interrelated problems. I set to work at once to divide and distribute this dangerous concentration of power. Under a new system, the 50 departments of the ministry were grouped into 10 large units, each in charge of a head who was directly responsible to the minister. These 10 heads of groups of departments were themselves formed into a council like a cabinet. The members of the council were charged with dual functions: first, to manage their group of departments; secondly, to take a general interest in the whole business of the ministry. They were to develop a council sense and not to regard themselves as confined to their own special sphere. Each group of departments was denoted by a letter. Thus D was design, G guns, F finance, P projectiles, X explosives, and so on. By ringing the changes upon these letters, committees could be formed exactly adapted to handle any particular topic, while the general movement of business was held firmly together by means of a coordinating or clamping committee. The big businessmen who now formed the council were assisted by a strong cadre of civil servants, and I obtained for this purpose from the Admiralty my old friends Sir William Graham Greene and Mr. Masterton Smith. Thus we had at once the initiative, drive, force, and practical experience of the open competitive world, coupled with those high standards of experience, of official routine, and of method, which are the qualifications of the civil service. The new organization was announced to the public on August 18 in a memorandum from which the following paragraphs are taken. The 4th year of the war, we are no longer tapping the stored-up resources of national industry or mobilizing them and applying them for the first time to war. The magnitude of the effort and the achievement approximates continually the limits of possibility. Already in many directions the frontiers are in sight. It is therefore necessary not simply to expand, but to go back over ground already covered, and by more economical processes, by closer organization, and by thrifty and harmonious methods, to glean and gather a further reinforcement of war power. It is necessary for this purpose that the Minister of Munitions should be aided and advised by a council formally established. The time has come to interpose between more than 50 separate departments on the one hand and the minister on the other, an organism which in the main will play a similar part and serve similar needs as the Board of Admiralty or the Army Council. It has been decided therefore to form the departments of the ministry into 10 groups, classified as far as possible by kindred conditions, placing in superintendence over each group an experienced officer of the ministry, and to form these officers into a council for the transaction of business of all kinds in accordance with the general policy which the minister receives from the cabinet. Footnote. See Appendix L. End of footnote. Here is my council as it began. Financial Secretary, Sir Laming Worthington Evans. Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Callaway. Groups of Departments. F. Finance, Sir Herbert Hambling. D. Design, Major General the Honourable Francis Bingham. S. Steel and Iron, Mr. John Hunter. M. Materials, Sir Ernest Moore. X. Explosives, Sir Keith Price. P. Projectiles, etc., Sir James Stevenson. G. Guns, Sir Glyn West. E. Engines, Sir Arthur Duckham. A. Allies, Sir Frederick Black, later Sir Charles Ellis. L. Labour, Sir Stephenson Kent. The Secretariat. At a later date, R. Requirements and Statistics, Mr. Layton. War Office Representative, Major General Furse. W. Trench Warfare and Inventions, Major General Steele. The relief was instantaneous. I was no longer oppressed by heaps of bulky files. Every one of my 10 councillors was able to give important financial decisions in his own sphere. The daily council meeting kept them in close relation with each other and with the general scheme, while the system of committees of councillors enabled special questions to be brought to speedy conclusions. Once the whole organization was in motion, it never required change. Instead of struggling through the jungle on foot, I rode comfortably on an elephant whose trunk could pick up a pin or uproot a tree with equal ease, and from whose back a wide scene lay open. Footnote. My minutes and memoranda of the time tell the story much better than any subsequent account which I could write. Accordingly, from very large numbers, I have selected enough to give a picture alike of the problem and the movement of events. These will be found in Appendix M. End of footnote. I confined myself to the assignment and regulation of work, to determining the emphasis and priority of particular supplies, to the comprehensive view of the war programs, and to the initiation of special enterprises. After 5 months' experience of the new system, I was able to say, I practically always approve a council committee report exactly as it comes. I think I have hardly ever altered a word. I read each report through with great attention and see the decision on the question, which I know is ever so much better than I could have produced myself, if I had studied it for 2 whole days. At the Ministry of Munitions I worked with incomparably the largest and most powerful staff in my experience. Here were gathered the finest business brains of the country, working with might and main and with disinterested loyalty for the common cause. Many, if not most, of the leading men stood at the head of those industries which were most expanded by war needs. They therefore resigned altogether the immense fortunes which must inevitably have come to them, had they continued as private contractors. They served the state for honor alone. They were content to see men of lesser standing in their own industries amass great wealth and extend the scale of their business. In the service of the Crown there was a keen rivalry among them, and the position of member of the Council, with its general outlook, was deeply prized. According to the statute constituting the office, the whole authority rested with the minister, but in practice the council had a true collective responsibility. If in these pages I dwell with pride upon the extraordinary achievement of the Munitions Council in the field of supply, it is not to appropriate the credit. That belongs in the first instance to Mr. Lloyd George, who gathered together the great majority of these able men, and whose foresight in creating the national factories laid the foundations for subsequent production. It belongs also to the men who did the work, who quarried and shaped the stones, and to whose faithful, resourceful, untiring contrivance and exertion the army and the nation owe a lasting debt. It would be difficult and invidious for me to single out individuals among those who are still living. Their service have not been unrewarded by the Crown, but there is one who has gone from us to whom this account offers me the opportunity of paying tribute. James Stephenson, footnote, afterwards Lord Stephenson, end of footnote, was the most ingenious and compulsive manager and master of difficulties, material and personal, with whom I have ever served. Whether at the Ministry of Munitions or after the war, when he accompanied me to the War Office and to the Colonial Office, no task, however laborious, no problem, however baffling, once it had been remitted to him, was ever a source of subsequent difficulty or complaint. With him, with his close colleague, Sir Arthur Duckham, and with the young, profound Professor Layton, who assembled and presented the weekly statistics, I was brought into the closest daily contact. These three constituted for me the mainspring, both of action and of review, by which the central control of the immense organization was exercised. Stevenson is dead. He died at 50, worn out as thoroughly as a brave soldier in the trenches, by his exertions in the public service. He left behind him a reputation sustained by the opinion of ministers of many departments and of all parties for ability, integrity, and devotion, which should afford an example and an inspiration to the businessmen of Britain. To the deep appreciation of his work and gifts declared by those in a position to judge, I wish to add my testimony. The relief afforded by the new organization in the general business of supply gave me time to pursue my ideas upon mechanical attack. After the apparition of the tanks at the taking of Flers a year earlier, in September 1916, and in the disappointment with which the end of the Somme battle oppressed the cabinet, I had, though in nominal opposition, some credit in official circles. At the wish of the Minister of Munitions, I had written a paper upon the greater application of mechanical power to the prosecution of an offensive on land. Mr. Montagu had it printed for the Committee of Imperial Defence and circulated it to the Cabinet. November 9, 1916. First. The condition of this war denied to the stronger power, whether on sea or land, its legitimate offensive scope. In all previous wars, the stronger army was able to force matters to a final decision. The great development of defensive power now prevent this. Second, we shall never have a superiority in numbers sufficient to triumph by itself. At present the fighting forces are much too evenly balanced. We have perhaps a superiority of 5-4 in fighting formations on all fronts. But the enemy's advantage of being on interior lines more than covers this. Even if we have a superiority of 6-4, that will be insufficient, and we are not likely to see a greater superiority than this for a very long time. Third, frontal attacks were abandoned 40 years ago on account of the severity of fire. Now that the severity of fire has enormously increased and is constantly increasing, they are forced upon us in the absence of flanks. Fourth, two methods of frontal attack have been tried. First, the unlimited, as at Loos and Champagne, where the troops were given a distant objective behind the enemy's lines and told to march on that, and second, the limited form, as tried by the Germans at Verdun, and by ourselves and the French on the Somme. Neither produces decisive results. The unlimited simply leads to the troops being brought up against uncut wire and undamaged machine guns. The limited always enables the enemy to move his artillery away and to sell a very little ground at a heavy price in life, gaining time all the while to construct new defenses in the rear. Eighth, an attack depends on two processes: A. Blasting power, and B. Moving power. Blasting power is very well provided for in the constantly improving supplies of guns and shells, but moving power is in its infancy. Ninth, two things stop the offensive movement of armies: A. Bullets and fragments of shell which destroy the motive power of men, and B. The confusion of the conflict. 15th. A method of covering these difficulties exists. It may be shortly described as the attack by armored vehicles. I cannot pretend to do more than outline it and suggest it. I am not an inventor or designer. I have no means of testing and elaborating these ideas. Evidently, they require study, experiment, and at least 6 months' preparation. But now is the time in the winter to organize and perfect this method of attack. The tanks have shown the way, but they are only a beginning. Footnote. The full text of this memorandum is printed in Appendix N. End of footnote. A year had passed. Nothing had been done. Mr. Asquith's government had fallen. Mr. Montagu was at the India Office, and I had succeeded his successor at the Ministry of Munitions. I had therefore the chance and the duty of giving effect, in one form or another, to the project of a mechanical battle which I had advocated when a private member. In the interval the tanks had been consistently misused by the generals, and their first prestige was markedly diminished. The War Office and General Headquarters had demanded from the Ministry of Munitions guns and shells on the basis of a 30 weeks continuous British offensive in 1918. The sketch programs, which I found upon taking office, were all framed on this assumption. No one contemplated such an event as a German offensive. The only question open was what was the best method of attacking the enemy. I drew up the following paper in the light of these acceptances. Footnote. The omitted paragraphs from this paper will be found in the second part of Appendix N. End of footnote. To the War Cabinet, October 21, 1917. First. In deciding upon the munitions program for 1918, the first question to be answered is, what is the war plan? When is it to reach its climax? Have we the possibility of winning in 1918, and if so, how are we going to do it? Second, it is obvious that the defeat and breaking up of the German armies in the West afford the best, the simplest and the swiftest method of arriving at decisive victory. The only question is, have we the power to do it? It would be a thousand pities to discard this direct and obvious method of victory in favor of weaker, more roundabout, protracted and far less decisive strategy, unless we are convinced that we have not the power to conquer on the Western Front. Ever since the autumn of 1914, we have heard the same accounts of the exhaustion of the enemy's manpower, of the decline of his morale, and of how near we stand if we only make the effort to the supreme and final result. Every year we have in consequence made exertions on the greatest possible scale, and every year the close of the campaign has seen the enemy's front, however dinted, yet unbroken. But this in itself is by no means conclusive, for the effects of our efforts upon the enemy have been cumulative. The exhaustion of his manpower and the deterioration of his morale have been progressive. Our superiority in munitions of all kinds has continually augmented. The offensive power of the British Army has continually increased. That of the French is still formidable. The German armies in the West, on the other hand, appear to have completely lost their offensive power. The Germans have now been, for 4 campaigns, extended to their maximum war effort. They have maintained in continual battle, upon all fronts, armies of 4 or 5 millions of men. The very efficiency of their organization enabled them to strain themselves to their fullest compass from the outset, and the draft which they have made upon the life energies of their whole nation is proportionately equal to and possibly greater than the draft which has been made upon the life energies of France. We can measure the effect of the strain upon the French, and this affords perhaps the best guide to the actual remaining fighting power of Germany. Therefore, it may well be that conclusions drawn from our disappointments in 4 successive campaigns would not apply to the 5th, and that the assertions and hopes that have proved unjustified in our successive campaigns might be vindicated in the end. For this reason, it is imperative not to abandon the Western effort and resign ourselves to the formidable dangers involved in the prolongation of the war into 1919, without the most searching consideration of all our resources. Fourth, if we are to conquer in the West, we must for that purpose provide for the concentration of all our methods of attack upon the enemy simultaneously at the decisive period. Fifth, success can only be achieved by the scale and intensity of our offensive effort within a limited period. We are seeking to conquer the enemy's army and not his position, and one stroke must follow another so rapidly that no breathing space for recovery or recuperation is afforded. Unless the effort reaches and is maintained at the required degree of intensity or on a sufficiently large scale, the campaign will be indecisive like all the others, however successful and profitable individual battles may have been. It is this principle of the intensity of the effort during a culminating period which must govern all our calculations. With armies so large as those which confront each other in the West, and with numerical superiority on our side which cannot be large, and may well be non-existent, a succession of heavy blows at intervals during the campaigning season may, however successful, result only in reciprocal losses without substantial altering the strategic situation. A policy of pure attrition between armies so evenly balanced cannot lead to a decision. It is not a question of wearing down the enemy's reserves, but of wearing them down so rapidly that recovery and replacement of shattered divisions is impossible. In a struggle between, say, 250 divisions on one side and 200 on the other, the small margin of superiority possessed by the stronger cannot be made to tell decisively before the winter respite is reached unless the war effort of the offensive reaches a far higher degree of general intensity than has hitherto been found possible. In other words, our attack must be of such a character that a division once used up on either side cannot reach the battlefront again during the culminating period in time to influence the conclusion. Unless this problem can be solved satisfactorily, we shall simply be wearing each other out on a gigantic scale and with fearful sacrifices without ever reaping the reward. Sixth, it is clear that in 1918 we cannot hope for any large numerical superiority in men. The relief which will be afforded to the German armies in the West by the collapse of Russia must be set against the reinforcement we shall receive from the United States. I have witnessed with profound disappointment the slow and frugal development of American fighting strength in France. From the day when America entered the war, the stream of American manhood, trained, half-trained or untrained, to Europe should have been continuous, and all the available means of transportation should have been assembled and continually used to their utmost capacity. The man, of course, being properly trained either on one side of the Atlantic or the other. The melancholy decision to adopt a different form of armament both for the infantry and artillery has also seriously retarded the development of American war power. This is now being realized by the American authorities, but too late. We cannot therefore count on any great superiority in numbers on the Western Front in 1918. Our calculations must proceed upon an assumption that there will be no decisive preponderance in the number of formed divisions, or in the number of men in the line, or in the reserves available within the year. We are, however, entitled to count upon a marked and possibly increasing superiority in quality and moral. There remain, in addition, only the great province of war machinery and the resources of superior generalship operating through war machinery. Will these suffice? Seventh, there are 6 principal forms of machinery by which our infantry on the Western Front, slightly superior in numbers, markedly superior in quality, may be aided, that is, artillery preponderance, air supremacy, railway or mechanical mobility, trench mortar development, tank development, gas development. In what way can these be combined and applied by generalship so as to produce the maximum intensity of offensive power during the culminating period? Part 5. 25th. It should not be supposed that victory in the West depends indispensably on a large superiority in numbers. When one army, partly from superiority in numbers, partly from superiority in moral, feels itself decidedly the stronger, it seeks to assume the offensive. What is lacking is an effective method of the offensive. A very large superiority in numbers would of course be one way, but we have no prospect of getting this. 3 or 4 times the artillery we have at present would be another method. But there is no prospect of getting this in the immediate future. Still, if a means could be found whereby the stronger and better army could advance continuously and at a sufficient speed on a front of 20 or 30 miles, a general retirement would unquestionably be forced upon the German armies. 26th. How then are we to find this method of continuous offensive, which is the inherent right of the stronger and better army, and the absence of which is the sole cause of the prolongation of the war? We have at present only the artillery. If you concentrate the bulk of the artillery of a great nation on a narrow battle front and feed it with the whole industry of the people, it is possible to pound and pulverize certain areas of ground, so that a limited advance can certainly be made. But the artillery is so local in its action, so costly in its use, and so ponderous in its movement, that the rate of the advance has not hitherto led to any decisive strategic results. It is clear, therefore, that the artillery alone is not sufficient, and will never be sufficient to impart to the stronger army the certain and irresistible means of advancing which it requires. It is becoming apparent that the blasting power of the artillery is only one of the factors required for a satisfactory method of the offensive. Moving power must be developed equally with blasting power. Moving power deserves as sustained a study, as extensive an application, and as large a share of our resources as have hitherto been given to the blasting power of the artillery. Moving power in the shape of railways, motor transport, light railways and tramways has already attained large dimensions up to the edge of the battlefield, but moving power on the battlefield itself is practically limited to the arms and legs of human beings. This is not enough, and it never will be enough, and until it can be supplemented on the battlefield by machinery of one kind or another, which can be brought into being and kept in working order in spite of intense battle conditions, the stronger army will remain robbed of its method of advance. 29th. If we may assume a stronger and better army, equally equipped with blasting power and moving power, and capable of operating continuously on a front sufficiently broad, Its success would not necessarily be dependent upon the relative numbers of troops available on either side in the whole theater of war. Whatever his strength in other parts, the enemy would be under a continual imperative obligation of arresting this offensive movement on a given front. Someone must stop the tiger. If the rate of advance was sufficiently rapid, lack of a great superiority in numbers would not paralyze the attackers, and even bringing superior numbers to the spot would not help the defenders. For the defensive even more than for the offensive, the numbers of men which can be usefully employed in given areas of ground is severely limited. Just as it may be said that the intensity of the offensive all along the front should be such as to make the whole line rock, and keep the enemy in continual movement and uncertainty. So the rate of progress of the attack on the main battlefield and the obstruction of communications behind it should be sufficient to prevent reinforcement before essential points are lost. 30th. When we see these great armies in the West spread out in thin lines, hundreds of miles long and organized in depth only at very few points, it is impossible to doubt that if one side discovered, developed, and perfected a definite method of advancing continuously, albeit upon a fairly limited front, a decisive defeat would be inflicted upon the other. If therefore we could, by organized mechanical processes and equipment, impart this faculty to our armies in 1918 or in 1919, it would be an effective substitute for a great numerical preponderance in numbers. What other substitute can we look for? Where else is our superiority coming from? 31st. A survey of these mechanical possibilities together with a computation of our resources compared to those of the enemy should afford the best means of judging the fateful question already postulated, that is, whether we have the means of overthrowing finally the enemy's main armies on the Western Front during the campaign of 1918.